What if the Godfather's death wasn't the end of an empire, but the spark that built a new one? In March 1980, a single gunshot in Philadelphia shattered the Mafia's throne and unleashed a war no one saw coming. Bikers laughed where mobsters ruled, alliances burned, and blood rewrote the rules of business. From the back alleys of Philly to the neon glow of Montreal and Los Angeles, this is the story of when rebellion learned organization.
Members of the pagan motorcycle gang with membership stretching from the Carolinas to New York, and today officials indicted pagan National President Paul Perry in New York.
The Godfather falls, the shot that changed. Philadelphia, March 21st, 1980. The quiet hum of Philadelphia's Passyunk Avenue was interrupted by a single gunshot that rewrote decades of Mafia order. Inside his car, Angelo Bruno, the gentle Don, who ruled with calm diplomacy, slumped lifeless against the passenger door. Blood trickled down the chrome handle of his Buick, and with it, an empire began to fracture. For over 20 years, Bruno had been the rare mob boss who preferred conversation over corpses. He believed stability meant profits, and violence only drew headlines. But beneath his measured tone and aging smile, resentment was already fermenting. Younger capos, impatient and greedy, whispered that his old-school ways were keeping them poor. They wanted to flood the city with cocaine and heroin. Bruno refused. The gunman that night didn't just kill a man. He pulled the pin on a grenade that would roll through every neighborhood from South Philly to Atlantic City. The official word came fast. The mob war was on. Bruno's underboss, Philip Chickenman Tester, took over, but his reign lasted barely a year. A nail bomb under his front porch blew him apart, a warning that the old order was finished. Into that chaos stepped Nicodemo, Little Nicky Scarfo, a 5'4" hurricane of paranoia and brutality who believed fear was power. Scarfo's first act as boss was simple: tax everyone. Every bookie, drug dealer, and fence operating in Philadelphia owed tribute. But ambition makes poor judgment. Scarfo's collectors pushed their luck when they tried to shake down the Pagans Motorcycle Club, demanding payments for permission to operate. To men like Scarfo, bikers were unruly street thugs, crude, undisciplined, disposable. But the Pagans weren't punks on Harleys. They were a paramilitary machine with a chain of command. Combat veterans who thrived on defiance. When Scarfo's men made their demand, the room filled with laughter, not fear. That laughter echoed across Philadelphia's underworld. For the first time, the Italian Mafia had met an enemy that didn't bow. When Scarfo's enforcers returned empty-handed, humiliated, the Sicilians didn't yet grasp what that meant. In their world, violence reasserted control. In the biker world, violence was the language of identity. The two were about to learn that difference painfully. The Pagans weren't just rejecting tribute. They were declaring independence. They didn't see themselves as tenants on mob turf. They saw the mob as an obstacle to expansion. Within weeks, quiet corners turned hostile. Bars once run by mob-connected bartenders found pagan patches hanging from stools. Illegal gambling machines were smashed, drug corners repainted in new colors. The bikers' message was unmistakable. Philadelphia was no longer a one-family town. For every mobster who grew up learning omertà and hierarchy, there was now a biker who believed loyalty belonged to brothers, not bosses. The street order had changed, and Scarfo, with all his rage and rules, had no idea how to fight a war against men who didn't believe in his throne. The Pagans strike back. When fear laughed in the Mafia's face. April 1982. Philadelphia was a city balanced on paranoia. Little Nicky Scarfo had transformed Bruno's quiet empire into a dictatorship of fear. Every loan shark, every bookie, every street hustler paid for the privilege to breathe. His word was gospel, his rage legend. But one afternoon, his soldiers made the mistake that would redefine the boundaries of organized crime in America. They showed up at a pagan motorcycle club hangout demanding tribute. The expectation was obedience. What they got was laughter. The bikers didn't just say no, they mocked the mob. One of the pagans reportedly asked Scarfo's collector if he brought a receipt book. Another cracked a beer open and toasted the absurdity of the moment. The collector walked out humiliated, alive only because the bikers found him too ridiculous to kill. That day, the Mafia's authority was punctured by laughter, and that laughter would cost lives. The Pagans weren't a loose gang of drunks on bikes. Founded in Maryland in 1959, they were one of America's Big Four outlaw motorcycle clubs, alongside the Hells Angels, Outlaws, and Bandidos. They were paramilitary in structure, with sergeants, national presidents, and regional officers. Many were Vietnam veteran men who'd seen real war, who understood ambush tactics, radio discipline, and the logistics of violence. Fear was not a language they spoke. When Scarfo's men reported back, they expected permission to retaliate. Instead, Scarfo hesitated. That hesitation was his first public crack. For decades, the Mafia had ruled Philadelphia like a monarchy, but this new enemy didn't live by Sicilian codes. They weren't bound by family loyalty or respect for made men. They were bound by brotherhood, by a different kind of blood oath. When Scarfo hesitated, the Pagans took that as weakness. Then came the spark. During a meeting to discuss methamphetamine distribution, Scarfo's underboss, Salvatore "Chucky" Merlino, rammed his car into a Pagan's motorcycle, injuring the rider. In the Mafia's mind, this was dominance. In the Pagans' world, it was a declaration of war. Within 48 hours, retaliation came swift and calculated. Merlino's associate's car was firebombed. Gunfire riddled the home of Caporregime, Salvatore Testa. Another shooting targeted Merlino's mother's house, a psychological strike that violated every unspoken rule of mob warfare. This wasn't random violence, it was a strategy. The Pagans were demonstrating operational discipline, the kind of coordinated response only the military or organized syndicates could pull off. It terrified the Mafia, because for once, the enemy wasn't hiding. They were laughing in the open, daring retaliation. Blood and brotherhood, how the Pagans redefined the streets.
Bruno's murder came just a few days after his appearance before the New Jersey Commission of Investigation, where he was questioned about his alleged ties with organized crime in South Jersey.
By the summer of 1982, Philadelphia's criminal ecosystem had changed. The Pagans weren't just another gang anymore. They had become a political force in the underworld, carving out a kind of sovereignty no one had dared claim before. Scarfo's tax failed, and instead of breaking under pressure, the bikers had turned defiance into diplomacy backed by gunfire. In the streets, the word spread: you don't tax the Pagans. To outsiders, this might have looked like another turf feud. But to those inside the world of organized crime, it was ideological. The Italian Mafia had always prided itself on structure, a strict hierarchy, rules passed down like scripture, and an obsession with respect. The Pagans lived by chaos that looked, on the surface, like anarchy, but it wasn't. Their chaos was organized. Their ranks, though rowdy, followed a chain of command that resembled a paramilitary unit more than a street gang. The Mafia worked in whispers. The Pagans preferred roars, and that noise began to attract attention. Their clubhouse meetings were massive, public, and loud. They'd roar through Philadelphia suburbs in formation, dozens of Harleys, chrome and leather, making a spectacle out of defiance. It wasn't just bravado, it was psychological warfare. Every cop, every rival, every mobster watching knew what that sound meant. We're here, and we're not afraid of you. Scarfo, meanwhile, was losing control. His reign of terror had alienated the very people who kept his organization running. Low-level associates whispered about how the bikers had done what no one else dared make the mob flinch. Those whispers stung worse than bullets. Because in the Mafia's world, power wasn't just about violence, it was about perception, and the perception was changing fast. Inside Pagan ranks, that victory changed everything. Their refusal to pay tribute wasn't just about pride. It was about rewriting their place in America's criminal food chain. Before, motorcycle clubs had been seen as unpredictable tools, useful for muscle, expendable for politics. Now, they had proven they could stand toe-to-toe with the old-world Mafia and win. That shift echoed across the country. In Baltimore, New Jersey, and even parts of New York, other motorcycle clubs took notice. The outlaws began muscling into traditional Mafia gambling rackets. The bandidos in Texas started taxing local drug operations that used to kick up money to Italian intermediaries. Everywhere, the same pattern was emerging. Bikers were no longer subcontractors. They were competitors. The pagan mafia war didn't just reshape Philadelphia, it reshaped respect. When federal agents compiled reports on Scarfo's empire later that year, they noted something unprecedented. Bikers were now classified as autonomous, organized criminal entities rather than auxiliaries. In bureaucratic language, that meant something profound. The government now saw motorcycle clubs as their own nations within nations. The Montreal Alliance, when Vito Rizzuto broke the code,
was the head of the Montreal Mafia. Now, he was a man with many enemies, but Rizzuto died of natural causes.
While Philadelphia burned under its own pride, something extraordinary was unfolding further north. In Montreal, a man named Vito Rizzuto, known as the Teflon Don of Canada, was rewriting every rule that men like Angelo Bruno and Scarfo had lived by. Rizzuto didn't believe in domination through fear. He believed in collaboration through profit. And in a city that sat between Europe and America, that belief would turn him into a criminal architect of a new world. Rizzuto's empire was massive, but delicate. He ruled not just the Sicilian Mafia in Montreal, but also the city's entire organized crime ecosystem. Irish, Haitian, Eastern European, and biker gangs alike. Unlike Scarfo's explosive reign, Rizzuto's genius was quiet. He understood that muscle could buy you obedience, but money bought you silence, and silence was power. In the early 1992, when Montreal's streets were bleeding from small gang wars and competing drug operations, Rizzuto saw an opportunity. Instead of fighting the outlaw bikers, he approached them. Specifically, Maurice Montboucher, the ferocious leader of the Hells Angels Quebec chapter, a man who had built his own reputation through brutality and absolute control. To outsiders, this alliance seemed impossible. An old-school Sicilian mobster joining forces with tattooed bikers who lived for chaos. But Rizzuto saw more than chaos. He saw logistics, loyalty, and reach. Boucher's Angels controlled the highways. They had distribution lines stretching from Montreal to Miami. Rizzuto controlled the ports, the arteries of cocaine flowing from South America. Together, they could build something far bigger than either had alone. Thus was born what law enforcement would later call the Consortium, a cooperative empire of organized crime, families and biker networks, united by profit, not tradition. The arrangement worked beautifully at first. The Mafia provided the global pipelines, money laundering through Sicilian banking networks, political influence, and access to suppliers. The Hells Angels brought street-level power, intimidation, and manpower. Together, they moved narcotics on an industrial scale, using refrigerated trucks, private cargo planes, and legitimate import businesses to mask shipments. The profits? Astronomical. Authorities estimate they were moving close to $1 billion in drugs a year through Quebec by the late 1992. And it wasn't just about drugs. Rizzuto began using the Angels as his enforcers of diplomacy. When smaller gangs refused to cooperate or pay dues, it wasn't suited-up mafiosi who showed up, it was bikers. Loud, visible, terrifying, yet they never said Rizzuto's name. That deniability was priceless. In return, Rizzuto made sure the Angels were never short on resources, connections, or protection. But alliances like that don't stay peaceful forever. Between 1994 and 2002, Quebec erupted into what would become the Quebec Biker War, a bloody 8-year conflict between the Hells Angels and their rivals, the Rock Machine. Over 160 people were killed. Bombs tore through city streets. Children were caught in crossfire. Montreal looked less like a metropolis and more like a war zone. Dinner with Devils, how the Mafia and bikers shared the table October 8th.
It's a time that, looking back, is almost hard to believe. This was Maurice Montboucher at a court appearance for his son. Boucher was the head of an elite
2000, Montreal. Inside the Blue Martin restaurant, the air was heavy with cigar smoke, disbelief. At a corner table sat 3 of the most dangerous men in North America: Vito Rizzuto, head of the Sicilian Mafia in Canada, Maurice Montboucher, the feared leader of the Hells Angels, and Frédéric Coup de Faucheur, commander of the Rock Machine. Around them, their lieutenants pretended to relax, but every movement, every whisper was weighed. Outside, police surveillance vans hummed, watching history unfold. For years, Montreal's streets had burned under the biker war. Bombings, shootings, and kidnappings had turned neighborhoods into open battlefields. More than 160 lives lost, including civilian victims of a silent war over the province's billion-dollar drug trade. But tonight was supposed to end it. Rizzuto, always the diplomat, had invited both factions to dinner. His logic was simple: war doesn't make money, but peace does. That dinner was surreal. Rizzuto, dressed immaculately in a dark suit, raised a glass of wine and toasted new understandings. Boucher and Faucher shook hands for the cameras, even smiled. For the first time, the Mafia, the Angels, and their enemies shared a meal. Afterward, the group headed to Super Sexy, Montreal's most infamous strip club, where they continued the charade of reconciliation. For a few hours, it looked like the violence was finally over. But underneath the smiles was a strategy. Rizzuto wasn't uniting enemies out of goodwill. He was protecting his empire. The war had drawn too much heat. Police raids were seizing shipments, freezing assets, and tapping phones. Every bomb blast risked exposing the delicate drug network that linked Montreal's ports to Sicilian suppliers and South American cartels. Rizzuto needed calm not for morality, but for business. The truce held briefly. Boucher, ever the showman, even joked with detectives staking out the restaurant that night. "Now that we've made peace, you can cut your budget in half." It was classic biker bravado, and the cops even laughed, but they knew better. Peace in this world was just a pause before reload. By early 2001, the Rock Machine defected to the Bandidos Motorcycle Club, expanding the conflict into an international war that spread across Canada, Europe, and the US. The ceasefire was shattered. Streets erupted again. Boucher was soon arrested for ordering hits on prison guards, and Rizzuto's patience with the chaos evaporated. Yet, even as bodies dropped, Rizzuto's vision survived. His system, the consortium, proved that collaboration between the Mafia and bikers wasn't just possible, it was profitable. Drug kingpins like Jimmy Cournoyer, a Rizzuto associate nicknamed Cosmo, took the model global. Cournoyer's operation moved more than $1 billion in marijuana and cocaine through the Hells Angels trucking routes, Mafia money laundering networks, and Sinaloa cartel supply lines. It was a multinational criminal corporation, structured like a Fortune 500 company, powered by blood. The Quebec Biker War, 8 years of blood and business. Between 1994 and 2002, Quebec descended into chaos. What began as a quiet struggle over methamphetamine routes and cocaine corners exploded into the deadliest criminal conflict in Canadian history. The Quebec Biker War wasn't just a turf battle, it was an industrial-scale power struggle between the Hells Angels, determined to monopolize Montreal's narcotics trade, and the rebellious Rock Machine, a club that refused to kneel. But behind the bullets and bombs were men in suits, Mafia brokers, drug financiers, and international suppliers turning bloodshed into business. The first shot was fired when the Hells Angels attempted to muscle out smaller dealers who refused to pay their street tax. The Angels Quebec chapter, led by Maurice "Mom" Boucher, demanded a 10% cut from anyone selling drugs in their territory. The Rock Machine, smaller but fiercely independent, refused. That refusal ignited a firestorm. Bars were blown up, cars torched, and bodies began dropping on both sides. In the first 2 years alone, over 50 people were murdered, including innocent bystanders. To the public, it looked like madness. To insiders, it was calculated chaos. Every explosion served a purpose: intimidation, retribution, leverage. But as the war escalated, so did collateral damage. In August 1995, a car bomb intended for a biker lieutenant killed one-year-old Daniel Desrochers, a tragedy that shocked the nation and changed how Canada saw organized crime. The streets were no longer underworld battlefields. They had become war zones in daylight. And yet, while bullets flew, the money kept flowing. The Hells Angels controlled the import routes from South America, while the Rock Machine tapped into European amphetamine supplies. Montreal became a marketplace for both profit and power. Police wiretaps later revealed that the Rizzuto crime family was profiting quietly behind the scenes, laundering biker money through construction contracts, nightclubs, and offshore accounts. They didn't care who won, as long as the drugs kept moving and the profits didn't stop. As the body count rose, law enforcement scrambled. The Carcajou Task Force, a multi-agency operation involving provincial and federal police, was formed to dismantle the biker networks. Over 300 officers worked full-time, infiltrating clubhouses, tapping phones, and tracing drug money. But even with millions spent, the Angels and Rock Machine continued killing faster than the police could arrest them. Then came the turning point. The Angels escalated. They didn't just want dominance, they wanted extinction. Using their superior resources, they declared an all-out extermination campaign against the Rock Machine. In less than 18 months, over 40 of the rival club's members and associates were executed. By 1999, the Rock Machine was on the verge of annihilation. Their leaders were either dead, jailed, defecting. They sought refuge under a new banner, the Bandidos Motorcycle Club, one of the world's big four biker organizations. That rebranding changed everything. What had been a local conflict became global. Suddenly, the Hells Angels weren't just fighting a Quebec gang, they were fighting an international organization with chapters across Europe and the U.S. The war entered its most violent phase. Bombings increased, drive-bys became daily, and the Angels responded with targeted assassinations. Throughout it all, Vito Rizzuto's Mafia quietly expanded its grip. They offered mediation when profits were at risk, supplied cocaine through Sicilian channels, and ensured that whoever emerged victorious would still owe tribute to them. When the smoke finally began to clear in 2002, more than 160 people were dead, 130 fires set, and 80 bombings recorded. The war ended not through a truce, but through exhaustion and mass arrests. The Operation Springtime 2001 raids crippled the Hells Angels' infrastructure, jailing dozens of members, including high-ranking officers. The Rock Machine fractured. Montreal was left scarred, both literally and politically. The Consortium, how Montreal became organized crime's capital. By the early 2000s, the bloodshed had slowed, but the money hadn't. Out of the rubble of the Quebec biker war rose a hybrid empire, a quiet agreement between killers and kingpins to stop wasting bullets and start counting profits. Law enforcement would later call it the Consortium, but to those inside, it was simply the business. At its core stood two names: Vito Rizzuto, the calculating Sicilian godfather who had survived every war, and Maurice "Mom" Boucher, the biker warlord who had turned chaos into strategy. Their model was revolutionary. Forget street corners and protection rackets. This was corporate crime. Each group kept its structure intact. The Mafia ran finance, politics, and international supply. The Hells Angels controlled territory, distribution, and intimidation. They no longer competed for control. They cooperated for efficiency. Every shipment, every deal, every payoff was mapped out like an industrial supply chain. At first glance, it seemed fragile. Two cultures, two codes. The Mafia's Omerta versus the Bikers' Brotherhood. Yet, Rizzuto understood how to bridge them. He treated the bikers not as soldiers, but as shareholders. Profits were divided, not tribute collected. The Mafia handled importation, laundering, and diplomacy with South American cartels, while the Angels ensured street-level dominance and enforcement. Everyone got paid. No one got disrespected. The scale was staggering. Intelligence analysts estimate the consortium was moving more than $1 billion in narcotics annually, mostly cocaine, ecstasy, and marijuana. The logistics were seamless. Shipments from Colombia docked in Montreal's port, disguised within legal imports. Biker-run trucking companies distributed the product across Canada and into the northeastern US, while Mafia-linked financial brokers in Montreal, Toronto, and even Italy laundered the proceeds. It was a perfect loop. Drugs in, money out, silence everywhere. The public had no idea. On the surface, Montreal thrived, construction boomed, nightlife glittered, and politicians smiled for cameras. Beneath it all, contracts, casinos, and clubs laundered billions. If you followed the paper trail from a high-rise condo to a biker bar in Laval, you'd find the same fingerprints: ghost corporations owned by bikers' girlfriends and mobsters' cousins, wired to offshore accounts in Panama, Cyprus, and Luxembourg. For law enforcement, it was a nightmare. The old methods, wiretaps, surveillance, and informants no longer worked. No one was talking, and there was no violence to investigate. The bikers had gone quiet, the mafia polite. Everyone in the consortium understood one rule: peace is more profitable than war. Still, it wasn't all harmony. Beneath the profit simmered distrust. Some old-school mafiosi whispered that Rizzuto had polluted La Cosa Nostra by letting tattooed savages into the boardroom. Meanwhile, younger bikers grumbled that the Angels were becoming too corporate, more accountants than outlaws. But the money silenced the noise. The FBI, RCMP, and Italian anti-mafia units began noticing strange patterns in drug shipments traced to both Sicilian ports and biker-controlled warehouses. In one intercepted call, a Rizzuto lieutenant joked, "They used to send soldiers, now they send invoices." It was dark humor, but true. Violence had become bad business. Even the Mexican cartels took notice. The Sinaloa cartel, led by Joaquin El Chapo Guzman, began routing product through consortium channels. Montreal became the new Miami, North America's gateway for South American cocaine. The Hells Angels handled the roads. The Mafia handled the banks. The New York pipeline, when bikers carried the Mafia's fortune. By the time the Quebec consortium was printing millions, whispers of its influence were reaching south, all the way to New York. For decades, the American Mafia's 5 families had treated the Canadian underworld like a distant cousin. Useful, rich, but unruly. Now, suddenly, the cousin had the keys to the cocaine gates. Montreal was the new hub, and the Bonanno family, weakened, infiltrated, and desperate, wanted back in. What they didn't realize was that the men moving the product weren't Sicilians in silk suits. They were bikers in denim and cuts. The connection began innocently enough. A man named Jimmy Cosmo Cornoyer, a Montreal-based smuggler with ties to both Rizzuto and the Hells Angels, started moving marijuana from Canada into the US in the late 1990 seconds. His operation grew too fast for traditional channels to handle. So Cornoyer turned to the bikers for transport and the Mafia for protection. The result? A billion-dollar pipeline that stretched from Quebec to Brooklyn, fueled by weed, cocaine, and ecstasy. Cornoyer wasn't your typical street criminal. He wore tailored suits, drove Ferraris, and used legitimate tech companies as fronts for his trafficking network. He built alliances like a CEO, strategic, transactional, and ruthless. The Hells Angels handled logistics, using truck convoys and hidden compartments to cross the border through native reserves like Akwesasne, where jurisdictional loopholes crippled law enforcement. Once in New York, the Bonanno family distributed the product through their old channels, restaurants, nightclubs, and construction rackets. It was a system that combined biker efficiency with mafia influence. For every shipment that reached the city, everyone got their cut. The Angels took a percentage for transport and muscle. The Bonannos took their share for local distribution and laundering. And Cornoyer sat in the middle, moving hundreds of kilos a week. Law enforcement was baffled. The DEA and FBI couldn't figure out who was really in charge. The Mafia's fingerprints were all over the financials, but the people doing the heavy lifting were bikers, tattooed men on Harleys, running logistics as cleanly as any freight company. The operation was so professional that some agents nicknamed it the Coca-Cola Company of Crime. But the alliance was more than business. It represented a philosophical shift. For the first time, 2 worlds that had historically despised each other had found balance. The Bonannos, reeling from the Donnie Brasco infiltration that shattered their hierarchy, needed new muscle and new money. The Angels, rich but politically unconnected, needed legitimacy in America's biggest market. Together, they filled each other's gaps. One meeting in 2009 summed it up perfectly. A Bonanno lieutenant reportedly told a biker liaison, "You guys ride loud. We move quiet. Together, nobody sees the whole picture." It wasn't just bravado, it was truth. The bikers' chaos masked the Mafia's control, and the Mafia's respectability disguised the bikers' aggression. Still, there were fractures. The old guard of La Cosa Nostra couldn't stomach sharing profits with tattooed outsiders. Rumors spread that some Bonanno capos wanted the Angels put back in their place, but when one of them sent soldiers to deliver a message to a biker bar in Long Island, it ended in humiliation. 3 made men walked in with threats and walked out bloodied. their suits torn, their pride ruined. It was the night the Mafia learned that physical intimidation no longer worked against men who'd learned war overseas and lived it every day in the streets. By 2012, the pipeline had reached its peak. Conoya's network stretched from Mexico's Sinaloa cartel through Canada and into the U.S. East Coast, earning more than $1 billion in drug sales. It was, in effect, a merger between the Mafia, bikers and cartels, an underworld and multinational. The West Coast Wars, Mongols, Mafia, and the Mexican connection.
The first chapter was formed in Montebello.
A group of Vietnam veterans had this.
While Montreal and New York perfected the art of cooperation, Los Angeles was living out the opposite, a return to open warfare. The West Coast had always been different. No old Sicilian bloodlines ran the show here. The L.A. crime family, once mighty under Jack Dragner and later the volatile Mickey Cohen, had dwindled into a shell of its former self by the 1,982nd. What remained was a handful of aging dons, small rackets, and an uneasy relationship with prison gangs and outlaw bikers who had long stopped taking orders from anyone. Enter the Mongols Motorcycle Club, a force born out of rejection. Founded in 1969 by Hispanic Vietnam veterans, denied entry to the Hells Angels due to race, the Mongols were the product of two worlds, military precision and East L.A. street survival. They grew fast, carving out territory from the San Gabriel Valley to Las Vegas, running drugs, guns, and stolen cars. There, discipline and loyalty made them as dangerous as any Mafia crew. By the 1,982nd, they weren't just surviving, they were winning. The Angels had been pushed out of Southern California, the Mongols ruled it. But their rapid rise brought them face to face with two formidable enemies, the Mexican Mafia, La M, and the remnants of the Italian-American crime syndicate trying to stay relevant. At first, the relationships overlapped mutual business, shared profits, and occasional truces. The Mongols supplied muscle and transportation for La M's drug networks, moving meth and heroin through biker and prison channels. The Italians offered money laundering and contacts with Vegas casinos. Everyone made money. Then, in 2004, the balance shattered. The Mexican Mafia's prison bosses demanded tribute payments from the Mongols' money they claimed was owed for operating in territories controlled by Hispanic gangs allied with La M. The demand wasn't a negotiation, it was a command. The Mongols' answer? No. The message that came back was even clearer: pay or die. But unlike street gangs, the Mongols didn't scare easily. Many of their members were veterans, trained in tactical warfare. When the first green light order came down from La M authorizing hits on Mongols members, the bikers armed up. Within days, gunfights broke out across East L.A. Bars, garages, and tattoo parlors became ambush sites. What had started as extortion turned into a war of survival. At the same time, the Italian Mafia, once mediators of such disputes, was powerless. The Los Angeles family, led by Peter Milano, lacked manpower and muscle. They could no longer enforce peace. The old system of quiet sit-downs in restaurants was gone. In its place, car chases, drive-bys, and revenge hits carried out by men who looked more like soldiers than gangsters. The violence grew so intense that even the DEA and FBI took notice. In one notorious 2006 incident, a Mongols hit squad ambushed a Mexican Mafia associate outside a strip mall in Ontario, California, killing him in broad daylight. Surveillance footage showed military precision, flanking, cover fire, clean retreat. To federal agents, it looked like a combat drill. Eventually, both sides realized the same thing Rizzuto had understood years earlier: war kills profits. By 2008, an uneasy truce formed. The Mongols would remain independent but agree to coordinate drug routes through Mexican suppliers. In return, La M called off the death orders. The Italians, meanwhile, were completely sidelined. For the first time in Los Angeles' history, organized crime had gone bilingual and leather-clad. Bloodlines of rebellion. Quebec's new generation declares war. 2 decades after the Quebec Biker War ended, the streets of Montreal were too quiet. The old kings of the underworld had aged out or adapted, trading pistols for portfolios. The Hells Angels ruled like executives, their leather replaced by linen, their violence outsourced. The Rizzuto Mafia had rebuilt after Vito's death, patching the old networks and restoring a fragile peace. For the first time in 50 years, Quebec's criminal world seemed stable. Then, in 2023, a new name appeared in police reports and news headlines: the Blood Family Mafia. They weren't Sicilian, Irish, or bikers. They were something else. A hybrid street organization born from the chaos the old guard had left behind. Their leader, David Pic Turmel, was only 27, but his reputation spread faster than any veterans could. He didn't dress like a gangster or ride like a biker. He lived online, flaunted money on social media, and commanded an army of young men raised on violence as currency. His message to the old order was blunt: your time is up. For years, smaller gangs had paid a 10% tax to the Hells Angels for the right to sell drugs in Quebec. It was an efficient system. No war, no chaos, just organized business. Turmel and his blood family decided they were done paying. Their rebellion wasn't just about money. It was about humiliation. They began targeting Angels' properties, burning cars, and recording torture videos of rival dealers who dared to quit their network. The footage was grotesque, viral, and impossible to ignore, spread across encrypted channels and social media feeds, shaking the criminal ecosystem to its core. At first, the Hells Angels tried to downplay the challenge. Old-timers mocked the Blood family as kids playing gangster. But when the bodies started showing up, dismembered, burned, live-streamed, the laughter stopped. In less than 6 months, over a dozen murders were linked to the new group. They weren't hiding in clubhouses or back alleys. They operated in daylight, drove exotic cars, and treated violence like performance art. Law enforcement watched in disbelief as Quebec's criminal order unraveled. The Blood Family Mafia had no respect for tradition. They didn't negotiate truces or recognize territories. They kidnapped, tortured, and executed without warning. Police wiretaps captured terrified dealers, whispering that the new generation was more cartel than Canadian. By late 2023, the conflict reached a boiling point. The Blood family stopped paying the Angels' tax altogether, an open act of war. Yet the response wasn't what anyone expected. The Hells Angels, once notorious for violent reprisals, hesitated. Their leadership, gray-haired men in their 50 seconds and 60 seconds, didn't rush to retaliate. They'd become businessmen now. Not bombers. A criminologist later described it perfectly. They're too old to go to war and too rich to die. So, in an unprecedented move, they negotiated. Provincial police sources later confirmed that Angels' representatives met quietly with intermediaries from the Blood family to discuss a ceasefire. It was the kind of meeting that would have been unthinkable 20 years earlier. Veteran, bikers, once symbols of terror, sitting across from tattooed 20-somethings who'd filmed torture for clicks. And here was the real twist. The Angels allegedly went to the police first. According to criminologist Maria Morani, sources told her the bikers were pleading for intervention. Do something, or we'll have to. For the first time in modern history, the enforcers of fear were asking law enforcement for help. In February 2024, police struck first. A massive operation across Quebec arrested 21 members of the Blood Family Mafia. Charges ranged from trafficking to murder to torture. But even behind bars, their message lingered. The old system had cracked. The new generation had shown that violence wasn't about hierarchy anymore. It was about spectacle. Digital outlaws. The rise of the cyber cartel age. By 2024, the underworld was no longer defined by streets and borders. It was defined by servers. The new generation of organized crime didn't need to meet in dimly lit bars or exchange envelopes under tables. They moved their money through cryptocurrency wallets, spoke through encrypted networks, and laundered billions through legitimate digital fronts. The mafia's leather shoes and the bikers' steel boots had both evolved into something far more elusive: digital footprints. The evolution didn't happen overnight. It started with the old alliances, adapting to survive law enforcement's modernization. The Rizzuto crime family and the Hells Angels, long masters of physical logistics, realized that the digital world could give them something violence never could: invisibility. Encrypted messaging apps like Signal, Wire, and Threema became the new clubhouses. Offshore server farms in Luxembourg and the Caribbean replaced stash houses. Instead of laundering money through bars or casinos, they ran it through NFT markets, cryptocurrency exchanges, and shell corporations registered to AI-generated identities. One of the first to master this digital transformation was a young Rizzuto associate named Marco Flux Di Stefano. Barely 30, fluent in blockchain coding and fluent in both Sicilian dialects and Python scripts, he turned what had been a local network of drug transactions into a decentralized digital empire. Under his guidance, the Mafia and the bikers started storing their wealth in crypto portfolios, shifting millions of dollars in seconds without ever touching a physical bill. The bikers loved it. For decades, their weakness had been paperwork. Now, there was none. Every drug shipment that moved through a Hells Angels route was recorded in code. The profits instantly split across dozens of anonymous wallets. Police could seize trucks, bikes, and safe houses, but not strings of numbers hidden behind 256-bit encryption. And it didn't stop there. Recruitment changed too. Motorcycle clubs no longer relied solely on street initiations. Younger digital prospects joined not for their skill in the lass of skill, combat, but for their expertise in hacking, cybersecurity, and social engineering. A new breed of outlaw emerged, men and women who could ride during the day and run darknet marketplaces by night. The traditional biker vest now shares space with laptops, drones, and encrypted phones. Meanwhile, law enforcement struggled to keep up. Old-school investigators who once chased drug routes were now forced to decipher crypto ledgers. The RCMP's Project Nobility, launched in 2023, exposed an intricate network connecting biker-run supply chains, Italian financial backers, and offshore crypto wallets tied to Dubai real estate investments. The discovery proved what most detectives had only suspected. Organized crime had gone global and digital. The Blood family Mafia, the new-age street predators, embraced this shift instantly. They used Telegram bots to coordinate kidnappings, Bitcoin ATMs to move ransom payments, and deepfake videos to threaten rivals anonymously. For them, the violence was just content. The real weapon was control of narrative and currency. Operation Springtime Revisited, when the law fought shadows. By the middle of 2025, Canadian and US law enforcement were no longer chasing gangsters. They were chasing ghosts. The old methods that once crippled syndicates' wiretaps, hidden mics, and sting operations now lag a decade behind the new generation's digital camouflage. The syndicates had evolved into networks that stretched across borders, powered by encrypted communication, offshore banking, and crypto laundering. But history, it seemed, had a cruel sense of repetition. So the police tried something familiar, but bigger. They called it Operation Springtime Revisited. The name was deliberate. It echoed Operation Springtime 2001, the legendary crackdown that once crippled the Hells Angels during the height of the Quebec Biker War. Back then, more than 100 bikers and Mafia associates were hauled away in dawn raids, their empires briefly silenced. But now, 2 decades later, the battlefield had changed. There were no visible clubhouses, no paper ledgers, no intercepted payphones. The new enemy existed behind usernames and offshore accounts. The plan was unprecedented. A coalition of agencies, the RCMP, DEA, FBI, Europol, and Interpol's cybercrime division, formed a single investigative unit. They weren't just tracking people, they were tracking data ecosystems. Their target, the Dark Consortium, a shadow alliance connecting remnants of the Rizzuto family, European Ndrangheta brokers, and multiple Hells Angels chapters using encrypted apps and cryptocurrency tumblers to conceal billions in narcotics profits. The first break came in an unexpected place: Dubai. Intelligence flagged suspicious crypto transfers tied to a Canadian logistics company that didn't exist on paper but owned 5 cargo jets. Tracing those transfers led investigators to Panama, where a biker-owned shell corporation was, routing consulting fees through a Dubai investment fund. The name on the paperwork meant nothing, but the signature did. It matched a man long presumed retired. A former Hells Angels regional enforcer, known only as Rico Marone, once linked to Vito Rizzuto's money laundering operations. To dismantle this new hydra, authorities went back to basics, boots on the ground. Physical surveillance of clean businesses began to reveal patterns. The biker-run trucking companies weren't shipping drugs anymore. They were shipping hard drives, servers, and crypto mining rigs disguised as industrial equipment. The profit margins made cocaine look primitive. The Ghost Kings, biker bosses who vanished into power.
Cracking the code of honor, brotherhood, and respect.
Don't be so tight. You'll be all right.
As the world digitized its wars, a strange phenomenon began to unfold inside organized crime. The disappearance of visibility. Gone were the flamboyant godfathers who flaunted cash, cars, and castles. In their place rose a quieter breed of leaders who learned to vanish, while multiplying their reach. They were known in police files as the Ghost Kings, the new generation of bikers and mafia bosses who managed vast criminal enterprises without ever showing their faces. Investigators first noticed the shift around 2021. Traditional biker presidents, once photographed in leather vests and chrome, were suddenly absent from public gatherings. Chapter photos stopped. Open clubhouse parties disappeared. Instead, leadership meetings were being held on encrypted Zoom clones hosted on offshore servers. Everything from money drops to territorial disputes now ran through layered proxies, each one distancing the real boss from any traceable activity. One of the most infamous examples was Ghost Mike D'Arienzo, a former Ontario Hells Angel who had supposedly retired to the Dominican Republic. For years, he ran a chain of beachfront bars, legitimate on paper, unremarkable in revenue. But a 2024 Europol investigation revealed that D'Arienzo was, in fact, managing over $80 million in cryptocurrency transactions for an interlinked biker mafia network. His bars weren't bars at all. They were laundering hubs, exchanging crypto for cash through tourists and shell corporations. No fingerprints, no records, no physical meetings. Meanwhile, in Sicily, police wiretaps captured whispers of another phantom, L'Invisibile, a mafia strategist believed to be coordinating logistics between European bikers and South American cartels. He never attended meetings. His orders came through anonymous voice filters routed through a server in Belgium. Every few months, a courier would receive a handwritten note burned after reading an echo of old traditions surviving in a new digital disguise. Even more fascinating was how these Ghost Kings maintained control without presence. In the old world, power was demonstrated physically, showing up at funerals, paying respect, and enforcing rules through intimidation. But the new underworld thrived on reputation and data precision. Orders were precise, financials clean, and retribution silent. An accountant might vanish after misrouting funds, but no one saw who gave the order. Loyalty wasn't sworn in blood, it was encrypted in code. This evolution made law enforcement's job nearly impossible. Wiretaps were obsolete. Digital tracking hit dead ends. Detectives used to identifying bosses by surveillance photos now stared at strings of IP addresses that changed every 6 hours. The Royal Canadian Mounted Police admitted that half of their top organized crime targets had no confirmed physical presence in any jurisdiction. But perhaps the most unnerving transformation was cultural. The outlaw identity, once loud, masculine, and ritualistic, had become clinical. The bikes, tattoos, and brotherhood codes were still there. But now, they served as camouflage for multinational criminal enterprises run like corporations. A single encrypted order from Dubai could set off a chain reaction. A drug shipment in Montreal, a money wash in Malta, a revenge hit in Marseille. The Ghost Kings had discovered the perfect crime, one where they didn't exist, and yet they still ruled through fear. Associates who questioned orders often met quiet fates, found suicided in hotel rooms, cars set ablaze, or simply gone. Even their funerals were silent. No insignia, no colors, no flags, just whispers in online forums that another ghost had been erased by his own kind. The hybrid empire, when outlaws became CEOs. By the mid-2025 era, the line between organized crime and organized business had blurred beyond recognition. What started as loose alliances between biker gangs and mafia families had now matured into something far more complex, a hybrid empire that looked less like an underworld and more like a multinational corporation. The men who once rode Harley-Davidsons in formation or held sit-downs in smoke-filled backrooms now wore tailored suits, managed import companies, and used corporate boardrooms as their new clubhouses. At the center of this transformation was a quiet truth. Power had outgrown violence. Guns still enforced order, but real control came from logistics, money flow, and digital legitimacy. The Hells Angels, once synonymous with chaos, had invested heavily in legitimate enterprises, shipping, construction, private security, and cryptocurrency mining. Their finances ran through clean corporate accounts and real estate holdings that spanned 3 continents. Across the ocean, remnants of the Rizzuto Mafia were doing the same. The Rizzutos had always been businessmen, but now their operations blended seamlessly with legitimate trade routes. Their front companies shipped coffee, furniture, and seafood. Real products with real profit, but every container also carried encrypted codes tied to digital wallets and off-ledger transactions. Customs officials often checked for drugs and found none. What they never saw was the data being moved alongside the cargo crypto keys, access credentials, and shadow invoices. One investigator for Interpol described it as crime with a dress code. No more gang tattoos or warehouse meetings. The new bosses signed contracts, filed taxes, and even attended charity galas. Their lawyers were former prosecutors, and their accountants once worked for Fortune 500 firms. Every paper trail led back to a legitimate business. Every legitimate business hid a darker profit stream. But perhaps the most fascinating evolution was psychological. The new generation of outlaws saw themselves not as criminals, but as entrepreneurs of risk. They understood market volatility, political instability, and technological disruption better than most CEOs. They used drones for surveillance, AI models to predict border patrol rotations, and deepfake identities for cross-border coordination. One leaked RCMP report noted that certain biker mafia partnerships operated with the discipline of a complicit hedge fund and the aggression of a cartel. In this world, alliances weren't sealed with blood, they were negotiated through spreadsheets. Biker leaders co-owned shipping companies with mafia investors. Street-level dealers became independent contractors. Profit shares were distributed automatically via smart contracts embedded in the blockchain. Disputes were settled not with fists, but with lawyers who specialized in corporate arbitration. However, the illusion of respectability came with a dangerous irony. As these organizations grew richer and cleaner, their street soldiers grew poorer and dirtier. The hierarchy was inverted. The men who once ruled with intimidation were now expendable labor. Violence still existed, but it had become outsourced and performed by freelancers or smaller satellite gangs paid through crypto wallets that self-deleted after use. And yet, the hybrid empire remained unshakable because it operated on 2 levels simultaneously, above ground and below it. A trucking company in Ontario might deliver legitimate goods by day and smuggle fentanyl precursors by night. A cybersecurity startup in Vancouver might help hospitals secure their data while quietly laundering cartel funds through its crypto contracts. Every front fed the machine. The new order, when shadows learn to govern. By the end of 2025, what had once been called organized crime no longer existed in the same way. It had evolved into something harder to define, a self-sustaining ecosystem that operated across borders, laws, and even ideologies. The old vision of mobsters in smoky rooms or bikers roaring down highways had given way to board meetings conducted over encrypted networks, partnerships registered as limited corporations, and war rooms running off cloud servers. This was not chaos. It was an order designed by those who once thrived on chaos. It began subtly. When global supply chains fractured during the pandemic years, the Biker Mafia Alliance stepped into the vacuum. They offered transportation when ports stalled, security when governments failed, and liquidity when banks hesitated. In some parts of Eastern Europe and Central America, their logistics companies became more reliable than national institutions. Economists quietly admitted that, in several border regions, organized crime kept trade alive. The outlaws had become indispensable. The cultural shift was equally striking. Pop culture, once obsessed with glamorizing gangsters, now blurred admiration with acceptance. Streaming series portrayed biker presidents and mob accountants as visionaries, not villains. Cryptocurrency influencers quoted Hell's Angels' business strategies on podcasts. The language of rebellion had been monetized, repackaged, and sold. Society had absorbed its own predators. Behind the scenes, however, the code of silence, the omertà that once ruled by fear, had been replaced by something colder: mutual interest. Violence was now a last resort, used only when contracts failed or digital sabotage couldn't solve a dispute. Assassinations were surgical, often disguised as data breaches, overdoses, or disappearances in remote jurisdictions. The new killers didn't leave gunpowder, they left corrupted databases. Governments tried to strike back with legislation and task forces, but the networks had learned governance faster than the states chasing them. They operated like a decentralized corporation with regional councils and profit-sharing systems. One Interpol report described them as a shadow parallel to global capitalism, identical in structure, different only in legality. The Hells Angels had once been born from rebellious men who rejected control. The Mafia had once existed to preserve family power against corrupt institutions. Now, they had become what they rebelled against: a system of control, surveillance, and profit. Freedom had mutated into an empire. In a way, it was inevitable. The old wars between bikers and the mob, Philadelphia's street battles, Montreal's uneasy truces, and Los Angeles's betrayals were never really about territory. They were about evolution. Each conflict forced both sides to adapt, absorb, and survive. Over decades, that survival instinct turned predators into administrators, soldiers into CEOs, and enforcers into economists. The world, as it stands, may never return to the simplicity of good versus evil, because the new order doesn't hide in shadows anymore. It builds the roads, finances the shipments, writes the contracts, and sometimes even enforces the law. When asked off record whether this new hybrid empire could ever truly be dismantled, a veteran RCMP agent paused for a long time before answering. And maybe that's the final irony of the story. The Mafia and the bikers didn't just survive the war. They won it by changing the very definition of what victory means. They stopped being outlaws. They became the architecture.